Imagine working a Roman wheat field under the Italian sun, chains biting into your ankles with every step, and when the sun finally sets, you do not go home. You go down a narrow staircase cut into the earth, into a pit roofed over with stone, lit only by a few high, narrow windows, positioned specifically so that no human hand could ever reach them from the inside. This was not a dungeon built for the worst criminals of Rome. This was where ordinary agricultural slaves slept every single night of their working lives, on countless farms across the Roman countryside for centuries. The Romans had a word for it: Ergastulum, and Hollywood has never shown it to you. Every time a film gives you the marble villa, the rolling vineyard, the senator strolling through his country estate admiring the harvest, there is something missing from that picture. Beneath that idyllic image of Roman agricultural prosperity sat an underground prison, purpose-built, professionally designed, and so common that the Roman agricultural writer Columella treated its construction as standard advice for any landowner running a serious farming operation. This was not an aberration. This was infrastructure. The poet Juvenal had a blunter name for it: Carcer rusticus, the rustic prison, the farm prison, not a metaphor. An actual, specific category of building that existed on Roman estates known as latifundia, the massive agricultural operations that fed the city of Rome and made its wealthiest landowners staggeringly rich. Columella, writing his agricultural manual in the 1st century AD, described exactly how an ergastulum should be built, with the careful, practical tone of a man giving advice on irrigation or crop rotation. Build it underground, he advised. Make it as healthy as the situation allows, meaning do not let your investment die of disease before you have extracted enough labor to justify the cost of acquiring them. Light it with narrow windows. And here is the detail that should make your skin crawl. Those windows needed to be positioned high enough on the wall that no one inside could reach them with their bare hands. This was not an accident of architectural style. This was a calculated decision, written down as professional guidance to prevent the people locked inside from ever touching freedom, even through a window. The etymology of the word itself carries an unresolved debate that in its own small way captures something true about how little dignity these spaces were afforded even in language. Scholars disagree on whether ergastulum derives from the Greek word ergasterion, meaning workshop, or from a related root, referring to a pillar to which slaves were physically tethered. Either origin tells you the same fundamental thing. This was never conceived primarily as a place of confinement in the way a criminal prison was. It was conceived as a production facility, a workshop, a piece of equipment for extracting labor, in which human bodies happened to be the raw material being processed. The Romans did not need a special word for cruelty here, because in their own framework, this was not cruelty. This was infrastructure, no more morally complicated than a grain silo or a plow. This framing matters because it explains why so few Roman writers, even those who occasionally expressed discomfort with specific instances of excessive cruelty toward individual slaves, ever mounted anything resembling a sustained moral objection to the ergastulum as an institution. Roman moral philosophy, even at its most progressive, almost never produced anything we would recognize as abolitionist thought. Seneca could write movingly about treating slaves with basic humanity, urging masters to remember that the man you call your slave sprang from the same stock and enjoys the same sky, and in nearly the same breath accept the existence of chained agricultural labor as an unquestioned feature of how Roman estates functioned. The contradiction did not register as a contradiction to most Romans because the entire economic structure of large-scale farming had been built, generation after generation, on the assumption that someone needed to be physically prevented from running away, and the ergastulum was simply the practical solution to that assumed problem. The slaves who lived this existence were called compediti or vincti, both words referring to being bound, chained, fettered. They worked the fields during daylight hours in shackles, and at night they were marched back underground and locked away until the next morning's labor began again. A trusted slave, given the title Ergastularius, oversaw the operation, managing the chains, managing the punishments, managing the human beings who had been reduced to functioning machinery for Roman agriculture. The scale of how many human beings actually passed through this system across Roman history is difficult to calculate with precision, but the underlying numbers are staggering by any standard. Roman conquests during the 2nd and 1st centuries BC flooded Italy with captives on a scale modern audiences rarely appreciate. Single military campaigns could produce tens of thousands of new slaves in a matter of months, dramatically outpacing any existing infrastructure for housing or managing them. Estimates for the enslaved population of Italy during the height of the late Republic run into the millions, and agricultural labor consumed the overwhelming majority of that workforce. Some economic historians studying Roman labor patterns estimate that slaves performed as much as 90% of labor within the primary agricultural sector during the height of the Republic and early Empire, the very sector the Ergastulum was built specifically to control. This means the underground prison was not a marginal curiosity affecting a handful of unlucky individuals on isolated farms. It was load-bearing infrastructure for an economic system that fed the city of Rome itself, supplied the grain that kept the urban population fed and politically stable, and generated the agricultural wealth that funded the villas, the art collections, and the political careers of the Roman elite, whose names survive in marble inscriptions and historical texts to this day. Every senator who commissioned a beautiful country estate, every wealthy patron who funded public games or civic monuments, was very likely drawing at least part of that wealth from land worked by men who slept in chains beneath the earth. This system was not rare. It was not the exception on some uniquely cruel estate, run by a uniquely cruel master. The Ergastulum was a standard feature of large-scale Roman farming, mentioned not as scandal but as routine practice by multiple agricultural writers across centuries. Cato in the 2nd century BC, Varro in the 1st century BC, Columella in the 1st century AD, and references continuing as late as Palladius in the 5th century AD. 4 separate agricultural manuals, spanning roughly 600 years of Roman history, all treating underground slave prisons as a normal, expected component of running a profitable farm. And here is something the popular image of Roman slavery almost never mentions. It could happen to you, even if you were born completely free. The Emperor Augustus found himself forced to take direct legal action against a specific and disturbing problem. Bandits, known as grassatores, were kidnapping travelers off Roman roads, both free citizens and escaped slaves alike, and selling them directly into the ergastular of large estates. Once inside, locked underground, chained to a work gang, who was going to verify your legal status? Who was checking paperwork in a pit beneath a wheat field 50 miles from Rome? Augustus had to institute formal inspections of ergastula, specifically because free Roman citizens were vanishing off the roads and resurfacing as anonymous chained labor on someone else's estate, indistinguishable from the slaves around them. This detail alone should reframe how you think about Roman slavery. It was not a closed, self-contained system where everyone's status was clear and stable. It was a machine with porous, dangerous edges, and the Ergastulum sat at the center of that machine, as both punishment chamber and laundering facility for human beings whose origins nobody downstairs was particularly interested in verifying. If that detail bothers you, subscribe to Erased from History right now, because we are about to show you exactly what happened when the people locked in these prisons finally fought back, and why their rebellion made the system even worse for everyone who came after them. In 73 BC, a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus escaped from a gladiatorial school in Capua, along with roughly 70 other fighters. What followed became the largest slave uprising in Roman history, eventually swelling to an army historian's estimate at well over 100,000 men, women, and children, drawn from agricultural slaves, gladiators, and the chained workforce of countless Italian estates. For 2 years, this army defeated Roman forces sent against them, including trained legions under consular command, before the Roman general Crassus finally crushed the rebellion in 71 BC, with 8 full legions. The survivors were crucified along the Appian Way in a line stretching for miles, a deliberate, visible warning stretching from Capua to the gates of Rome itself. Here is the part that connects directly back to the Ergastulum. Landowners across Italy watched the Third Servile War unfold with genuine terror, because they understood exactly where that rebellion had started, with chained agricultural workers who had nothing left to lose. Rather than loosening the system that had produced such desperate, dangerous men, Roman landowners did the opposite. Historical analysis of the period shows Ergastula usage intensifying after Spartacus's revolt, as estate owners doubled down on underground confinement specifically to isolate anyone who showed signs of defiance, to physically separate potential troublemakers before they could organize, communicate, or plan another uprising.
The rebellion that should have exposed the cruelty of the system instead became the justification for making that system more rigid and more permanent. The archaeological evidence for what daily existence inside this system actually looked like comes from one of the most famous disaster sites in human history, Pompeii. When Mount Vesuvius buried the city in AD 79, it preserved a horrifying snapshot of Roman slavery in physical form.
Excavators have found agricultural work gangs at Pompeii's surrounding estates, discovered chained together in death, exactly as they had been chained together in life, their skeletal remains locked in the same shackles that bound them to their labor the moment the eruption began. These were not people who had a chance to run. They could not run. They were bound to each other and bound to the earth, even as it killed them. Other skeletal remains recovered from the region show something equally disturbing in its quiet, clinical detail. Chronic arthritis and visible distortion of limb bones, conditions that researchers have directly attributed to extreme overwork combined with severe malnutrition sustained over years. This is not literary exaggeration or moralizing from a hostile ancient source trying to make Rome look bad.
This is bone evidence, physical and undeniable, confirming exactly the kind of body-breaking labor that the agricultural manuals describe in their cool, practical instructions for managing a chained workforce. There is an important historiographical complication here, and we want to be honest about it rather than overstating our case. Despite the clear and repeated literary evidence for Ergastula across 6 centuries of Roman agricultural writing, direct archaeological confirmation of these specific underground structures remains surprisingly limited. A handful of excavated buildings, including a semi-subterranean structure with unusually thick walls found at Roman Colchester in Britain, have been proposed as possible Ergastula, but the identification is not universally certain.
Some researchers have suggested that ordinary granaries may have doubled as confinement spaces for certain slave laborers, given their proximity to existing storage infrastructure. The textual record describing Ergastula is extensive and consistent. The physical excavated record is thinner than you might expect. This gap between written sources and archaeological confirmation does not mean Ergastula were invented or exaggerated by ancient writers.
It means precisely the opposite of what Hollywood implies when it shows you Roman slavery at all. The reality of agricultural slavery in Rome was so routine, so embedded in the unremarkable daily mechanics of farm management, that it rarely generated the kind of dramatic, scandalous documentation that survives for events like gladiatorial combat or political assassination. Nobody wrote scandalized exposés about Ergastula because nobody important found them scandalous. They were simply how a farm was run, recorded with the same flat, practical tone you would use to describe the proper construction of a grain silo. Not every enslaved person in Rome experienced anything close to this. This is a crucial point that the popular imagination of Roman slavery consistently flattens into a single uniform horror. Educated and skilled slaves, particularly those working in urban households, could occupy positions as physicians, accountants, secretaries, business managers, and tutors, with realistic paths toward eventual manumission and even Roman citizenship for their own children. Slavery in Rome operated on a brutal hierarchy, and at the very bottom of that hierarchy, chained underground every single night of their working lives, sat the agricultural laborers the Ergastulum was specifically engineered to contain.
The gender breakdown of who actually lived inside these underground prisons reveals something particularly grim about how Roman landowners thought about incentivizing obedience versus enforcing punishment. The agricultural writer Varro recommended that estate overseers, the praefecti who were themselves enslaved but held positions of trust, should be granted female companions, specifically as an incentive to maintain their loyalty to the estate. Columella made a similar recommendation regarding the villicus, the steward, managing daily farm operations. But the chained, punished population, locked inside the Ergastulum itself, was overwhelmingly, almost exclusively, male. Women were the reward system for compliance. The Ergastulum was the consequence system for defiance, and Rome built it almost entirely for men they had identified as dangerous, untrustworthy, or already guilty of trying to escape. By the 2nd century AD, something remarkable happened. The Emperor Hadrian formally abolished the Ergastulum as part of a broader package of reforms intended to curb the worst abuses landowners inflicted on enslaved populations. Think carefully about what that abolition actually tells you. An emperor of Rome, ruling over a society that had normalized chattel slavery for centuries without serious moral objection, looked specifically at the underground farm prison and decided this particular practice had become so abusive, so dangerous in the hands of tyrannical masters that it needed to be eliminated by imperial decree.
Rome tolerated slavery as an economic and social foundation for the entire duration of its existence. The Ergastulum was abusive enough, even by Roman standards, that it earned its own specific prohibition. Whether that prohibition was actually enforced with any consistency across the vast Roman countryside, far from any inspector's reach, is a separate question historians still debate. Laws banning specific cruelties did not always translate into farms quietly dismantling their underground pits the following season. But the formal abolition itself stands as documented proof that the Ergastulum had become recognized at the highest level of Roman government as a uniquely brutal institution within an already brutal system. So, why does this particular piece of Roman history almost never make it onto your screen?
Why do you get the marble columns, the wine harvests bathed in golden light, the senator surveying his fertile land with quiet satisfaction, and never once a glimpse of what was happening underground after the sun went down? Because the Ergastulum does not fit the aesthetic Rome has been sold to you as for the last century of film and television. Gladiator gives you the arena. Ben-Hur gives you the galley. Popular culture has built an entire visual language around Roman cruelty that is loud, theatrical, and contained within spectacle, public executions, combat entertainment, dramatic punishment, staged for an audience. The Ergastulum offers none of that spectacle. It offers something far more disturbing in its mundanity, a hole in the ground built according to professional specifications, where human beings were locked away every single night, not as punishment for a crime, not as entertainment for a crowd, but simply as standard agricultural procedure, recorded in farming manuals, alongside advice on crop yields and irrigation schedules. There is no dramatic villain monologue in an Ergastulum. There is no crowd watching. There is only a narrow window too high to reach, a chain attached to an ankle, and a system so thoroughly normalized that the men who designed it discussed window placement with the same tone they used to discuss the optimal depth for planting wheat. The Romans built an empire that gave the world roads, aqueducts, concrete, law, and a model of governance that influenced 2,000 years of Western civilization. They also built underground pits to cage the human beings whose forced, chained, unpaid labor fed that empire's cities and filled its landowners' coffers, and they wrote down the architectural specifications for those pits with the same calm professionalism they applied to everything else they built. That contradiction, the genius and the cruelty existing side by side, recorded in the same agricultural manuals, built by the same engineering mind, is the truth Hollywood erased. If you want the history they don't put in the movies, subscribe to Erased from History, because next week we go somewhere even darker.